Pearl Street Gamble. When Edison bet everything on 110 volts and 400 lamps. On September 4, 1882 at 3 p.m., John W. Lieb stood excitedly 9 meters away from the main switchboard at 257 Pearl Street. His hand reached for a brass switch lever controlling the flow of electricity to 85 customers in Lower Manhattan. The lever was cold to the touch. The dynamo room hummed with a noise no New Yorker had heard before that summer. The synchronized rotation of 6 massive generators, each weighing 27 tons and named after P.T. Barnum's famous circus elephant Jumbo, who had died 3 weeks earlier in a railway accident in Ontario, had begun. Lieb was Edison's chief engineer. He was quite young, only 26 years old. He had been working with Edison for 4 years, since the days when the incandescent lamp was still in its experimental stages. The filament burned for hours, and investors called the whole venture Edison's folly. Now, he was examining a system that would prove those investors wrong. The system had cost $300,000 to build. Edison had invested $78,000 of his own money. If the system failed this afternoon, if the bulbs didn't light, if something caught fire, or if the voltage dropped too low to produce visible light, the Edison Electric Lighting Company would cease to exist. The room was hot. On the second floor of the building, 6 jumbo dynamos powered Armington and Sims piston steam engines. Downstairs, in the boiler room in the basement, 4 coal-fired boilers produced steam at pressures that Edison's engineers had tested for 6 months. The building at 257 Pearl Street was a converted warehouse. The original structure had been reinforced with ironwork to support the weight of the generators, but the wooden floor still creaked when the engines ran at full speed. The building was 7.6 meters long and 30 meters wide. This was a turning point in the history of electricity, a major event that would change human life. It contained equipment that would change history. Lieb looked at his watch. It was 2:58 p.m. Edison was waiting 2 blocks away at 23 Wall Street in the private office of J. Pierpont Morgan, one of Edison's main investors, at Drexel Morgan & Company. Morgan's office would be lit by 106 incandescent bulbs. Morgan had paid for this setup out of his own pocket, not because he believed in electricity, but because he wanted to be first. Morgan was a shrewd investor who understood that being first in a new technology was more valuable than being wrong. At 2:59, a messenger arrived from Morgan's office. The messenger was about 14 years old and was out of breath from running. He handed Lieb a folded note. Lieb opened the note. It was written in Edison's handwriting. Turn off the switch at 3 o'clock, not before, not after, at exactly 3 o'clock. Lieb looked at his watch. It was 2:59 and 40 seconds had passed. He went to the switchboard. He grasped the brass lever with his hand. Besides him, 5 electricians stood at the monitoring stations, watching the voltage meters, checking the connections, and waiting, ready to shut down the circuits one by one if anything went wrong. The system was designed to supply 110 volts of direct current to 400 lamps in 85 buildings via 80,000 feet of underground copper conductors. The conductors were insulated with beeswax, linseed oil, and asphalt. They ran through lines made of iron pipes buried under the streets. No one had ever built anything like this before. It was unknown whether it would work for even an hour, let alone indefinitely. At exactly 3 p.m., Lieb pulled the lever down. The dynamos began to spin rapidly, and the steam engines had already started moving. However, no current flowed beyond the station until Lieb closed that switch. When the lever engaged, current flowed at a speed approaching the speed of light through the underground system. In Morgan's office, 106 lamps flickered, slowly brightened, and remained steady. 52 lamps came to life in the offices of the New York Times. In the basement printing room of Heinz Ketchum & Company, Edison's first commercial facility in January 1881, 68 lamps began illuminating the massive printing presses. Lieb maintained his position at the power station. The voltage meters showed a steady output, 110 volts. When they checked, there were no fluctuations. The current was within design limits. The dynamos continued their synchronized rotation. Everything seemed fine. The building did not catch fire. The wooden floors did not collapse. There were no short circuits in the underground conductors. The system worked. But Lieb was not relieved. He knew what Edison knew. 5 minutes of operation was not the same as 5 hours. 5 hours was not the same as 5 days. 5 days was not the same as forever. Edison had assured investors that this system would operate continuously, providing cheaper, more reliable electricity than gas. That promise was now being tested. The first hour passed. Then the second hour. At 5 p.m., the sun began to set. This was the critical moment. Gas lamps required manual lighting at dusk. Edison's lamps, however, only required someone to press a button. In the first district, a rectangular service area bounded by Wall Street, Nassau Street, the East River, and Spruce Street, people watched the lamps glow dimly as the afternoon drew to a close, dreaming that these lamps would soon become the primary source of light in their offices and homes. The lamps did not flicker like gas lamps. They did not produce soot. They did not consume oxygen. They did not require someone to walk around with a match. By 6 p.m., the news had spread throughout Lower Manhattan. Crowds gathered in front of the power plant on Pearl Street. They weren't celebrating. They were waiting for an explosion. Everyone knew electricity was dangerous. Everyone had heard that the electric chair was being developed to replace hanging as a method of execution. Everyone thought that concentrating so much electrical energy in a single building would eventually lead to disaster. The crowd waited anxiously. At 7 p.m., Lieb was changing shifts. The new electricians were taking their places at the monitoring stations. Lieb remained at the power plant. He would remain there for 12 hours until the night shift supervisor took over at 3 a.m., but even then, Lieb did not leave the building. He slept on a cot in the office on the 3rd floor. He was on standby in case any problems arose. At 9 p.m., Edison arrived at Pearl Street. He had spent the afternoon and evening at Morgan's office, at the New York Times, at various customer locations, watching the lamps, answering questions, and reassuring the doubters. Now, he wanted to see his station as soon as possible. He went up to the 2nd floor where the dynamos were running. The noise was extraordinary, and this noise pleased him, a deep mechanical hum that could be felt from the floor, the walls, and the chest cavity of everyone standing nearby. Edison stood next to the number 1 jumbo dynamo. He placed his hand on the cast iron body. The metal was warm, but not too hot. The bearing temperature was within acceptable limits. There were no signs of excessive wear on the leather drive belt. Everything was working as designed. Edison found Lieb at the power plant. "Is there a problem?" "No, sir. The voltage is stable at 110. The current is within limits. No circuit failure." Edison frowned, but did not appear relaxed. Relaxing could close the path to success, and that was the last thing Edison wanted. Edison expected success. However, he understood that expectation and reality were different things, and that the difference between them was measured by equipment failure, investor confidence, and public perception. So far, reality was progressing in line with expectations. At midnight, the load decreased as the lights in the office were turned off. The dynamos continued to turn, but the current draw dropped by about 40%. This was expected. Residential customers kept their lights on later than commercial customers. By 2 a.m., the load stabilized at about 60% of its peak level. The system was designed to handle these fluctuations. The voltage remained stable. At 3 a.m., Lieb's position would be taken over by the night shift supervisor. Lieb was replaced by William Andrews, a Scottish engineer who had been working for Edison since the Menlo Park days. Lieb went up to the office on the 3rd floor. He lay down on the stretcher in his clothes. He fell asleep immediately. The last thing on his mind while conscious was the voltmeter showing a steady and unchanging value of 110 volts. He woke up at 6:30 a.m. He went downstairs. Andrews was still at the power station. "Is there a problem?" "No." The voltage remained constant all night. Lieb checked the records. The electricians working the night shift had recorded the voltage and amperage readings every 15 minutes. Each reading showed 110 volts, plus or minus 2 volts. The system had operated continuously for 15 and a half hours. By September 5th, the newspapers had picked up the story. The New York Times, one of Edison's customers, published a story under the heading, "Various City News." An unnamed reporter described the scene at Morgan's office. The firm's office was lit by 27 electric lamps, Edison's new invention, the incandescent electric lamp. The light was soft, bright, and pleasing to the eye, and working with a light that flickered almost not at all and did not emit enough heat to cause headaches was like writing in daylight. The reporter's account was accurate but insufficient. What the reporter failed to capture was the historical significance of what was happening. For the first time in human history, electrical energy was being delivered simultaneously to multiple customers from a central station via an underground distribution network. This was not an isolated system serving a single building. This was not an experimental demonstration. This was a commercial service. This was the beginning of the electrical grid that would ultimately power civilization. However, success brought new problems. Within a week, customer demand exceeded capacity. 6 jumbo dynamos could power approximately 7,200 lamps. By September 11th, Edison had signed contracts for 8,400 lamps. He couldn't meet this demand. He needed more dynamos, more boilers, more coal, and more space. But 257 Pearl Street had already reached maximum capacity. The building couldn't bear the additional weight. The basement couldn't accommodate more boilers. The system had reached its limit. Edison's solution was to purchase the adjacent building at 255 Pearl Street, which he had set aside specifically for this purpose. He immediately began installing additional dynamos and boilers. However, construction took time. Between September and November 1882, Edison operated at the limits of his system's capacity for 3 months. Each new customer pushed the dynamos closer to their production limits. Every lamp that was turned on meant lower voltage for existing customers. Voltage meters showed values as low as 104 volts during the busiest hours of the evening. The lamps dimmed. Customers complained. Other customers received whatever voltage remained. This arrangement worked until November, when a lawyer named Howard Caldwell, whose office received inconsistent voltage, threatened to sue Edison for breach of contract. Edison settled by offering Caldwell a full refund and 6 months of free service. By December 1882, the expansion at 255 Pearl Street was complete. The system now has 12 jumbo dynamos and 8 boilers. Capacity had doubled. The voltage was stabilized at 110 volts throughout the entire circuit. Customer complaints had ended. However, the expansion had cost an additional $150,000. The Edison Electric Light Company was now $450,000 in debt, with monthly revenues of approximately $8,000. At this rate, it would take 5 years to break even. Investors were not patient. At the December board meeting, several investors proposed closing the Pearl Street plant and selling the equipment to recoup their investments. Edison argued that closing would damage the company's credibility and make it impossible to license the system to other cities. Morgan supported Edison. The vote was very close. 7-5, the decision was made to continue operations. The Edison Electric Illuminating Company survived by 2 votes. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was very harsh. Coal prices skyrocketed due to labor strikes in Pennsylvania. Edison's coal costs increased by 35%. At the same time, natural gas companies, facing competition from electric lighting, lowered their prices by 20%. Edison's economic advantage disappeared. By February 1883, the company was losing money on every kilowatt-hour it was delivered. Lieb proposed a solution: run the dynamos at a higher voltage to produce more power using the same amount of coal. The dynamos were designed for 110 volts, but could theoretically handle 120 volts. The increased voltage would allow the company to serve more customers without adding more equipment. Edison rejected the idea. Operating the equipment beyond its capacity violated engineering principles. He had built the system to be safe and durable. Pushing the voltage beyond capacity limits carried the risk of equipment failure and customer safety. Instead, Edison lowered prices. In March 1883, he reduced the cost of electricity service from 24 cents to 20 cents per kilowatt-hour. This was the same cost as gas lighting. Revenue dropped immediately. However, customer acquisition accelerated. By June 1883, Edison was serving 513 customers with approximately 10,000 lamps. The system, which started with 85 customers and 400 lamps, had grown 25-fold in 9 months. But growth created new technical problems. The underground conductor system had been designed for the original service area, District 1. As Edison added customers beyond District 1's boundaries, the conductor lines grew longer. Longer lines meant higher resistance. Higher resistance means voltage drop. By August 1883, customers at the edge of the service area were receiving 95 volts instead of 110 volts. Their lamps burned a pale yellow instead of a bright white. Lieb's solution was elegant, switching from a 2-wire system to a 3-wire system. In a 2-wire system, current flows from the generator through one conductor to the lamp and returns through a second conductor. In a 3-wire system, a neutral wire is added between 2 phase wires, each carrying 110 volts. This configuration provides 220 volts between the phase wires, but only 110 volts between each phase wire and the neutral wire. The advantage is that the same amount of power can be transmitted using significantly less copper. Less copper means less resistance. Less resistance means less voltage drop. The reconfiguration of the underground conductor system took 6 months. By February 1884, the 3-wire system was operational. The voltage was stabilized at 110 volts throughout the entire expanded service area. Customer complaints ceased. However, the conversion had cost an additional $80,000. The company's debt now stood at $530,000. The financial pressure was relentless. Every technical success required capital investment. Every capital investment increased the debt. Every debt payment required revenue. Every revenue increase required more customers. Every customer requires more capacity. Every capacity increase required more capital. This cycle was unsustainable. In June 1884, Edison proposed a radical solution: halt the expansion work on Pearl Street. Instead, license the technology to other cities and collect royalties. Allow investors in other cities to assume the financial risk of building central stations. The Edison Electric Light Company would become a technology licensor rather than an electric utility. The board of directors approved. By December 1884, Edison had licensed his system to 121 cities across America. Royalty payments provided a steady stream of income that did not require continuous capital investment. The Edison Electric Light Company's financial crisis stabilized. The company was not profitable, but it was no longer losing money. However, licensing created a new problem: competition. After Edison's patents were made public, other inventors began developing improvements. The most significant rival was George Westinghouse, who advocated alternating current, AC, over Edison's direct current, DC. AC had a significant advantage. Transformers allowed the voltage to be increased for long-distance transmission and reduced for customer use. This meant AC systems could serve larger areas from a single central station. DC systems like Pearl Street required separate stations every few kilometers due to voltage drop limitations. Edison considered alternating current dangerous. High-voltage transmission lines pose a risk of electric shock. Alternating current motors were unreliable. The technology had not yet been proven. However, Westinghouse's alternating current systems were cheaper and could serve more customers per station. By 1887, alternating current systems had begun to be installed across America, competing with Edison's direct current systems. The technical debate spilled over into the public arena and became ugly. Edison staged demonstrations showing the dangers of alternating current by electrocuting animals with high-voltage alternating current. Westinghouse responded by demonstrating safe alternating current installations. The press dubbed this the War of Currents. The battle lasted for years, and despite Edison's technical objections, alternating current gradually prevailed due to its economic advantages. However, Pearl Street continued its operations. Despite technical difficulties, financial crises, and competitive threats, the system, put into operation by John W. Lieb on September 4, 1882, continued to grow day by day and continued to provide electricity to Lower Manhattan. On January 2, 1890, at 2:47 p.m., a fire broke out on the third floor of the building at 257 Pearl Street. The cause could not be determined with certainty. It was probably an electrical short circuit or a piece of coal from the boiler room, or perhaps just bad luck. The fire quickly spread to the wooden interior of the building. Workers were evacuated. No one died. However, the equipment was lost. All 6 original jumbo dynamos were lost. All 12 boilers were damaged beyond repair. The underground conductor system remained intact, but the generator station was completely destroyed. A power outage occurred throughout District 1 at 2:51 p.m. After 7 years, 4 months, and 29 days of uninterrupted operation. The Pearl Street system was plunged into darkness. Edison and Lieb were notified immediately. They arrived at Pearl Street at 3:30 p.m. The fire was still raging. They stood across the street and watched the flames bursting through the windows. Everything they had built was disappearing. 7 years of work, millions of dollars invested, the proof that their system worked. Edison turned to Lieb and asked, "How long will it take to restart the service?" Lieb looked at the burning building. He made calculations. 6 dynamos had been destroyed. 12 boilers had been damaged. The control equipment had melted. The switchboards were gone, but the underground conductors were intact. The customer connections were intact. They didn't need to rebuild the entire system. They only needed to rebuild the generator equipment. 11 days, Lieb said. Edison nodded. Begin. Lieb worked day and night. He salvaged everything he could from the wreckage. He ordered replacement dynamos from Edison's manufacturing facilities in Schenectady. He hired construction crews to rebuild the interior of 257 Pearl Street. He coordinated with boiler manufacturers to expedite delivery of replacement equipment. In a temporary office on Nassau Street, he slept 3 hours a night on a cot. On January 13, 1890, 11 days after the fire, John W. Lieb turned off the main switch of the rebuilt Pearl Street system. Electricity was restored to the First District. The system had been out of service for 264 hours. This was the first and only prolonged outage in the history of the Pearl Street station. The fire and the rapid recovery that followed became legendary in the electricity industry. This event demonstrated not only technical competence, but also institutional resilience. It revealed that the electricity grid was not merely a collection of equipment, but a service concept that transcended individual components. Equipment could be replaced, buildings could be rebuilt, but the commitment to keep the lights on was permanent. The Pearl Street plant continued to operate until 1895. By that time, larger and more efficient power plants had been built across Manhattan. Technology had moved beyond Edison's original direct current, DC system. Alternating current, AC, was winning the current war. Pearl Street was now obsolete. In 1895, the plant was decommissioned. The equipment was sold or donated to museums. The buildings at 255 and 257 Pearl Street were sold to private owners. Only the 9th of the original 6 jumbo dynamos survived the 1890 fire. It was donated to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, where it is still on display today. The building at 257 Pearl Street was demolished in the early 1900s. The site is now a parking lot. In 1917, the New York Edison Company placed a bronze commemorative plaque at the corner of Pearl Street and Ferry Street. The plaque reads, "Site of Pearl Street Station, the first commercial electric power plant in the United States, opened September 4, 1882, closed 1890. John W. Leib." Continued to work for Edison for another 37 years. In 1903, he became vice president of the New York Edison Company. He served as president of the American Institute of Electrical Engineers from 1904 to 1905. In 1923, he received the AIEE Edison Medal for the development and operation of electric power plants for lighting and power. He retired in 1919 at the age of 63 and passed away in 1929. Leib's obituary in the New York Times mentioned his role in expanding New York's electrical infrastructure. His presidency of the AIEE was mentioned. The Edison Medal was mentioned. But Pearl Street was only mentioned in one sentence. Mr. Leib was chief electrician when Thomas Edison's Pearl Street power plant went into operation in 1882. Just one sentence. 47 years of electrical engineering work reduced to a single sentence about one day in 1882. But that single day was more important than anything else. September 4th, 1882 was the day centralized electric power became a reality. Not experimental, not theoretical, real, commercial, reliable, scalable. That day, John W. Leib flipped a brass switch, finally putting a system into operation that would power human civilization. Thomas Edison died on October 18, 1931. His funeral made national news. President Hoover proposed that all electricity in the United States be turned off for 1 minute in Edison's memory. This proposal was rejected on the grounds that it was impractical, as many critical systems relied on a constant supply of electricity. However, on the day of Edison's funeral at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, the lights across America were dimmed for 1 minute. Millions of people experienced the era before Edison, that is, darkness. 60 seconds later, the lights came back on. But those 60 seconds showed what Edison had given the world. Not just the incidental light bulb, not just the electrical grid, not just technology. He had given the world the expectation that darkness could be permanently eliminated, that night could be conquered, that human activity would not have to stop when the sun went down. That expectation began on Pearl Street in a converted warehouse, with 6 dynamos named after a dead elephant, with a chief electrician who pulled a brass lever at exactly 3 p.m. and brought light to Lower Manhattan. If you visit the corner of Pearl Street and Ferry Street today, you will find a parking lot. You will see a bronze plaque installed in 1917. You will see office workers passing by, unaware, unknowing, unseeing, that they are standing where the modern world began. This plaque does not mention John W. Leib. It does not mention the 85 customers who trusted Edison's technology from day one. It does not mention the 513 customers who kept the lights on despite technical problems and natural gas price competition. It does not mention the 11-day recovery process after the 1890 fire. It only mentions dates. It opened in 1882 and closed in 1890. But those 8 years changed everything. They proved that electrical energy could be reliably transmitted from a central station. They established the business model for electric distribution companies that would be replicated thousands of times around the world. They showed that electricity was not just a curiosity or a luxury, but infrastructure. It was a basic necessity. It was the foundation for everything that followed. In 1929, the New York Edison Company built 3 working-scale models of the Pearl Street Station. One is on display at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., one at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan, and one at the Con Edison Learning Center in Long Island City, New York. The models are precise, detailed, and meticulously crafted. They show the 4 floors of 257 Pearl Street, the boiler room on the first floor, the dynamo room on the second floor, and the control equipment on the 3rd and 4th floors. Small electric motors inside the models make the miniature dynamos turn, the miniature steam engines move back and forth, and the miniature forced air fans rotate. The models are beautiful, but they are also outdated. They represent a technology that has been replaced by other technologies over the past 20 years. Direct current, DC, gave way to alternating current, AC. Low voltage gave way to high voltage. Small local stations gave way to large regional grids. Everything Edison built on Pearl Street was eventually replaced by something better. But the idea remains. The idea that electrical energy must be centrally produced and widely distributed. The idea that reliability is more important than innovation. The idea that infrastructure is a commitment that transcends individual equipment or individual people. These ideas began on Pearl Street. They are still with us. They are encoded in every power plant that keeps the lights on today, in every transmission line, in every distribution network. When you flip a light switch and the light turns on instantly, reliably, without a second thought, you are experiencing the legacy of Pearl Street. When you plug your phone into an outlet and electricity flows uninterrupted, you are benefiting from the decisions made by John W. Lieb in 1882. If you depend on electrical energy for heating, cooling, communication, transportation, computing, or entertainment, you are living in the world created by Pearl Street. This world began in a quarter-mile square area in Lower Manhattan with 400 lamps and 85 customers. Today, the North American power grid serves 334 million people across 6.4 million square miles. It consists of 200,000 miles of high-voltage transmission lines and 5.5 million miles of distribution lines. It represents the largest machine ever built by humankind, and it all began on September 4th, 1882, when a 26-year-old electrician named John W. Lieb flipped a switch, proving that Thomas Edison's impossible dream was finally possible. If you understand that it was built by people who refused to accept the impossible, leave a comment below. Tell us what you think. Talk about the infrastructure you depend on without thinking. Talk about the people who built the systems that make your life possible. And if you want more stories about the moments when everything changed, the decisions that shaped our world, the people who built the future we inherited, subscribe to this channel. Like this video. Share it with someone who thinks history is boring, because history isn't boring. History is the record of every moment when someone said, "This is impossible," and another said, "Watch me." Pearl Street proved that centralized electricity was possible. The rest followed from that proof. The world we live in, instant communication, ubiquitous computing, climate-controlled environments, electric transportation, digital entertainment, all of it depends on the power grid. And the power grid began on Pearl Street. The next time you flip the light switch, remember this.